The scent of polished mahogany and aged wine filled the air as Mila balanced a tray of crystal glasses, weaving through the grand ballroom of the Caldwell Club. The chandeliers above cast a golden glow over the marble floors, the kind of extravagance she had grown used to witnessing but would never belong to. Servers dressed in crisp black and white hurried past, each one carefully choreographed to ensure perfection. The guests, San Francisco's wealthiest, most powerful figures, had yet to arrive, but the final touches of the gala setup were in motion. Mila kept her head down, focusing on her work. It was easier that way. Every moment spent here was a reminder of how far she had fallen from the life she had once envisioned for herself. The world of music had been everything to her. A violin in her hands had felt as natural as breathing, each note a reflection of her soul. But talent wasn't enough. When her father lost his job, the scholarships and competition fees dried up. The dreams she had fought for slipped away, replaced by the cold reality of bills, rent, and the need to survive. Now, instead of commanding the stage, she carried trays and refilled glasses for people who would never see her beyond her uniform. She had learned to ignore the opulence surrounding her, the dazzling gowns, the chatter of old money. But tonight, something caught her eye. In the lounge, nestled in a glass display case, stood a violin unlike any she had seen before. Its varnish gleamed under the dim lighting, the delicate curves and finely carved scroll whispering of craftsmanship beyond anything she had ever touched. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a work of art. She took a step closer, drawn by something deep in her bones. Her fingers twitched at her sides, the muscle memory of years spent practicing still ingrained in them. The way the strings rested against the polished wood, waiting to be played, filled her with a longing so sharp it almost hurt. Lost in the moment, she didn't hear the footsteps behind her. "You shouldn't get attached," a voice drawled. She turned sharply, pulse quickening as she met the cold, calculating gaze of Damien Caldwell. The club's owner stood with effortless confidence, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his expression unreadable. The man was a ghost in the halls of this place, rarely making an appearance unless it involved power, money, or control. His reputation preceded him, a brilliant businessman with an unnerving ability to cut people down with nothing but words. I was just wasting time." He arched a brow, taking a slow step forward. "Admiring something you can't have?" Mila swallowed hard, resisting the urge to step back. "It's a beautiful instrument," she said simply, keeping her voice steady. "Beautiful?" Damien scoffed, his gaze flicking to the violin before settling back on her. This violin was handcrafted in Italy by one of the most renowned luthiers of the 20th century. "It's worth more than you'll make in a lifetime." The word stung, but she refused to let it show. He studied her, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that wasn't worth his time. Then, a smirk curled at the edge of his lips. "Let me guess. You used to play." Mila lifted her chin slightly, though she wasn't sure why she even cared to answer. "Yes." His smirk deepened, but there was no warmth behind it. "And now you're here. Serving drinks. How poetic." She clenched her fists, nails pressing into her palm. There was no malice in his tone, just a detached amusement, as if her existence was nothing more than an unfortunate inevitability. He leaned against the display case, his gaze still locked on her. "Tell me, what's worse? Losing the chance to play? Or knowing that even if you had it, you'd never be good enough to belong in a place like this?" Heat rushed to her cheeks, a mixture of anger and humiliation. She didn't know what she had expected: sympathy? Understanding? From a man like Damien, that was laughable. She forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to let him see how much his words had cut. "Excuse me, sir. I have work to do." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked away, back straight, head high. But as she returned to the flurry of preparations, the weight of his words clung to her, pressing against the part of her that still remembered what it felt like to hold a violin and believe that dreams could be more than just fleeting illusions. The distant hum of conversation filled the private lounge of the Caldwell Club, blending with the clinking of crystal and the shuffle of polished shoes against marble floors. Waiters moved in coordinated precision, adjusting centerpieces and ensuring that not a single champagne flute was out of place. Outside, luxury cars lined the entrance, their drivers standing in quiet formation, waiting for the arrival of the city's elite. At the center of it all, Damien Caldwell stood by the bar, his gaze sharp, his expression unreadable. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand, though he hadn't taken a sip. He never drank at his own events. Control was everything, and alcohol had a way of dulling the edges. Music had once been his world. He could still remember the feeling of his hands moving effortlessly over the keys, the quiet hush of an audience holding its breath, waiting for the next note. But that life had ended in a single moment, a cruel and unforgiving twist of fate. He hadn't touched a piano since. Now, his world was built on power, deals made in hushed conversations over expensive dinners, contracts signed in private lounges where no one ever spoke of things as foolish as passion. Damien had once been the kind of musician who made people stop and listen. Not just because of skill, though he had plenty of that, but because of something more, an ability to take a simple melody and make it feel like a conversation, like a secret being shared only with those willing to hear it. As a child, he had been a prodigy, the kind of boy whose fingers danced effortlessly over the piano keys, whose name was whispered in conservatories as someone to watch. By the time he was 20, he was playing in competitions across Europe, earning standing ovations in grand concert halls, his future unfolding like a perfectly written score. And then there was Isabella. She had been his anchor, the person who reminded him that music was not just about precision but about feeling. She was a violinist, her talent as breathtaking as her presence, and together, they had made music that felt like magic. They played duets in quiet corners of practice rooms, dreamed of performing together on the world's biggest stages. He had been reckless with love, certain that nothing could break them. But certainty is a fragile thing. On a winter night that still haunted him, Isabella had been driving home from a late rehearsal when an icy road stole her from him. One moment, she had been laughing, promising to see him in the morning. The next, she was gone. After that, he stopped playing. The music that had once filled him with purpose became something unbearable, a reminder of what he had lost. He withdrew from the world he had once thrived in, walking away from competitions, from performances, from the future that had once seemed so inevitable. The industry that had once celebrated him moved on, as it always did, and he let it. He told himself that dreams were for fools, that all the talent in the world couldn't change how easily life could take everything away. With nothing left to hold on to, he turned to what he understood best, business. He had always been as meticulous with numbers as he had been with notes, and it wasn't long before he found a new path. He made his first investments in hospitality, using his instincts and discipline to build an empire from the ground up. His name became synonymous with exclusivity, power, and precision. And when the Caldwell Club came up for sale, he bought it without hesitation. It was supposed to be just another business venture, but something about owning a place where music thrived, even in the background, felt like a final, silent claim to the past he had abandoned. A reminder that he was no longer the boy who had once believed in music and love. That Damien Caldwell no longer existed. He had perfected the art of detachment. Empathy was a weakness, and he had no patience for those who still clung to illusions. People came and went, but in the end, everyone was replaceable. That was a lesson he had learned the hard way. The event tonight was a spectacle, carefully designed to reinforce his influence. The guest list had been curated down to the last detail: CEOs, investors, and socialites who understood that being in his good graces was as valuable as any business deal. Everything had to be flawless, and that meant no distractions. Which was why, when he spotted Mila weaving through the lounge, he frowned. She moved with practiced efficiency, balancing a tray of empty glasses, her posture stiff with focus. Unlike the other servers, she kept her head down, her expression carefully neutral, as if trying to disappear into the chaos around her. He had seen that look before. The quiet determination of someone trying not to be noticed. He found it amusing. People like her never lasted long in places like this. They either adapted or got crushed under the weight of their own limitations. His gaze drifted toward the violin encased in glass just beyond the bar. He hadn't thought much of her fascination with it earlier, but now, watching the way she deliberately avoided even glancing in its direction, he felt a slow, calculated idea forming in the back of his mind. The club was crowded with staff preparing for the evening, everyone too preoccupied with their tasks to notice him observing her. She moved quickly, never lingering in one place for too long, always staying just out of his orbit. Smart. But not smart enough. Mila had no idea she was being watched. She was too focused on her work, making sure she stayed far away from the lounge where the violin rested, far away from the man who had humiliated her earlier. The last thing she needed was another interaction with Damien Caldwell. She had already learned that lesson. She adjusted the tray in her hand and made her way toward the kitchen, moving swiftly through the maze of guests beginning to filter in. She could hear the conversations already starting, the laughter that belonged to people who had never known struggle. She didn't envy them. Not anymore. That part of her had been forced into silence long ago. What she did envy was the music. The way the violin in that case wasn't just an object, it was a memory of everything she had lost. She had thought she had buried it, thought she had made peace with the fact that some dreams weren't meant to survive reality. But seeing it had unearthed something painful, something raw. And she had no time for raw emotions. Not tonight. She slipped into the kitchen and exhaled, grateful for the temporary escape. The other staff bustled around her, voices overlapping as last-minute details were checked. She set her tray down and reached for a glass of water, pressing the cold rim against her lips. Busy out there, one of the other servers, Anya, asked as she adjusted the bow tie on her uniform. Always, Mila said, forcing a small smile. Rich people love their champagne, Anya muttered, rolling her eyes. And their ridiculous demands. Mila chuckled softly. It was the closest thing to a conversation she had allowed herself all night. She liked Anya, but she kept to herself at work. It was safer that way. She set her glass down and straightened her uniform. I should get back out there. Anya sighed. We always should. Mila stepped back into the lounge, the shift in atmosphere immediate. The crowd had grown larger, the energy more electric. The evening was in full swing now, the low hum of conversation mixing with the distant notes of the string quartet playing near the entrance. She moved toward the bar, careful, calculating. If she kept to the edges, avoided the main rooms, she could get through this without incident. But fate had other plans. From across the room, Damien watched her every movement. He could tell she was being deliberate, keeping her distance, trying to stay invisible. That only made him more interested. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, still untouched, and leaned back against the bar. He had always believed in the power of control, in knowing exactly how to push someone just far enough to see what they were made of. Tonight, Mila was going to learn exactly where she stood. The idea formed so easily in his mind, it felt inevitable. He didn't even have to think about it. The opportunity was too perfect to waste. He spotted her again, carrying another tray, her movements precise. She was trying to avoid him, but it wouldn't matter soon. A slow smirk crossed his lips. Let the game begin. The gala was in full swing, a perfect blend of wealth and spectacle. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in warm golden light, casting soft reflections over polished marble floors. Conversations hummed like a well-rehearsed symphony, punctuated by the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. Servers moved in choreographed grace, ensuring not a single glass went empty, not a single guest was left unattended. Mila had almost convinced herself that tonight would be uneventful. that she could get through it without incident. But then Damien Caldwell stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room, and something in the air shifted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth, commanding. Instantly, all conversations faded into expectant silence. He exuded the kind of effortless authority that made people listen, whether they wanted to or not. "It's always a pleasure to host such an extraordinary evening with all of you. And tonight, I thought we'd add a touch of spontaneity. A little, unexpected entertainment." Mila stilled, her fingers tightening around the tray. Damien's gaze swept across the room before settling on her. He smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "One of our very own has a hidden talent," he continued. "And I think it would be a shame if we didn't all get to witness it." The moment stretched, and then he gestured toward the grand violin resting in its glass case. "Mila," he said, with an ease that made it sound almost casual. "Come up here and play for us." A murmur rippled through the guests, heads turning, curious eyes settling on her. Her entire body went cold. She wasn't sure what was worse, the sharp, unexpected exposure or the way he said it, like it was inevitable, like he had already decided she would do it and now she simply had to comply. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. A server should never be the center of attention. A server should blend into the background, unnoticed, unimportant. Damien tilted his head, a hint of amusement playing at the edges of his mouth. "Come now, don't be shy." A few chuckles spread through the room, the kind of laughter reserved for watching someone squirm under a spotlight they never asked for. Mila's pulse pounded in her ears. She could refuse. She could shake her head and walk away, endure whatever punishment came from denying a request from the club's owner. But then what? Let him win? Let him remind her, in front of all these people, that he held all the power? No. She took a breath, set down her tray, and walked forward. Damien stepped aside as she approached, gesturing toward the violin like he was bestowing a gift instead of setting a trap. The case had already been opened. He had planned this. Mila reached for the instrument, her hands unsteady as her fingers brushed over the smooth wood. It was heavier than she remembered, or maybe that was just the weight of expectation pressing down on her. She positioned it against her shoulder, her grip familiar but foreign all at once. Silence fell over the room. She lifted the bow, placed it against the strings, and played. The first note wavered, unsteady. A few whispers stirred in the crowd. She closed her eyes, forced herself to breathe. Her body still knew this. Somewhere beneath the years of neglect, beneath the struggle and exhaustion and the fear, the music was still there. She played. The hesitance melted away, muscle memory taking over. The bow glided across the strings, each movement more fluid than the last. A melody filled the space between chandeliers and crystal, something raw and aching and deeply, unmistakably hers. The guests stopped whispering. No one moved. The music swelled, cascading through the room, wrapping itself around the air like something alive. The weight of the moment faded, and for the first time in years, she wasn't just existing. She was playing. She was feeling. And then it was over. The final note hung in the air before dissolving into quiet. Mila lowered the violin, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. A beat of silence. Then, applause. Loud, unmistakable applause. She barely registered it. She barely registered anything except the rush of emotion rising in her throat, threatening to choke her. She didn't want this. She didn't want their validation, their polite admiration. She hadn't done this for them. She set the violin back in its case with careful precision. Without a word, she stepped off the stage. Damien was waiting at the edge, his arms crossed, a knowing smirk tugging at his lips. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" he murmured. She walked past him without answering, her heart still hammering, her hands still shaking. She didn't understand why she was so angry. Maybe it was the way he had made her do this, forced her to bear something private in front of people who would forget her the moment the next drink was served. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in years, she had remembered what it felt like to play. And that terrified her more than anything. The crowd had returned to their conversations, the hum of laughter and clinking glasses filling the club once again. But for Mila, the moment still clung to her like a second skin. The applause, the murmured astonishment, the sheer vulnerability of being forced into the spotlight, it lingered. Her hand still felt the shape of the violin, her ears still echoed with the music she had unleashed, and deep inside, something unfamiliar stirred. A longing she had buried years ago. She slipped back into her role as if nothing had happened, retrieving a discarded napkin from a nearby table, refilling a half-empty wine glass. But the world had shifted, just slightly. The way guests glanced at her now was different, as if seeing something new. It made her skin prickle with unease. A low voice beside her cut through the noise. That was extraordinary. Mila turned, instinctively cautious. The man standing before her wasn't one of the usual guests. He had an air of quiet authority, dressed in a dark suit that seemed more practical than showy. There was something familiar about his face, though she couldn't quite place it. "I'm sorry." "You play beautifully," he said, his tone even, as if stating an indisputable fact. That wasn't just skill. That was artistry. Mila tensed, unsure how to respond. Compliments from strangers were meaningless. Polite admiration was easy to dismiss. But there was something in his expression that unsettled her, something knowing. "I'm Gabriel Sterling," he said, offering a slight smile. "I fund several music programs, including the Sterling Fellowship for Classical Musicians. I'd like to invite you to audition." Her breath caught. She had spent years silencing the part of her that dreamed of this very moment, of someone important noticing her, of an opportunity like this falling into her lap. Yet now that it was happening, all she felt was panic. She forced out a polite response. "That's kind of you, but I don't." "You do," he interrupted smoothly. "And you should." Mila swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. The idea of stepping into that world again made her stomach twist. It wasn't just about playing, it was about what it meant to want something again. Gabriel held out a small card. "The audition is next week. Think about it." She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against the thick paper. She knew she should say thank you, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she nodded and walked away. The card felt heavier than it should as she slipped it into her pocket. The next few days unraveled her carefully constructed sense of self-preservation. The invitation sat in the back of her mind, haunting her at the quietest moments. While wiping down tables, while navigating the busy streets of the city, while lying in bed staring at the ceiling. She had spent years convincing herself that music was a closed chapter, a part of her past she had made peace with. But had she? Or had she just been running from the weight of failure? She had been playing since she was 6, back when her fingers barely stretched across the strings, when the violin had felt too big for her small hands. Her mother had taken her to every lesson, sitting patiently in the corner of the studio, smiling at every broken note, every mistake. By the time she was 10, she was performing in recitals. At 13, she was winning competitions. At 17, she was already being watched by conservatories that promised futures paved in music. It had felt inevitable, like the universe had carved out a place for her. Then reality struck. When her father lost his job, the scholarships weren't enough. Tuition, travel, lessons, everything added up. Slowly, pieces of her dream were chipped away. First, she stopped private lessons. Then, she let go of master classes, of auditions, of opportunities. By the time she was 19, the dream had crumbled completely. She had to work. She had to survive. The violin became something she played in secret, late at night in a tiny apartment, for no one but herself. Eventually, even that stopped. The thought of stepping back into that world now, years later, felt impossible. Who was she to think she still belonged there? But then there was the other side of it. The way she had felt on that stage, when the fear faded, when the music took over. It had been more than memory, it had been something alive, something real. She hated Damien Caldwell for putting her in that position, but she hated herself more for realizing she wanted it. By the third day, she had convinced herself to throw the card away. But she didn't. By the fourth, she rehearsed turning down the offer in her head. But she didn't. By the fifth, she found herself in a music store, running her fingers along the smooth wood of a violin she couldn't afford. By the sixth, she had made her decision. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't confidence. It was something quieter, something unsteady but unrelenting. She dialed the number on the card, her breath shallow as she waited. Sterling Foundation, a voice answered. She hesitated. Just long enough to make her doubt herself. Then she forced herself to speak. This is Mila Carter. I'd like to confirm my audition. And just like that, she stepped back into a world she had sworn she would never enter again. Mila stood outside the conservatory, staring through the grand windows at the musicians inside. The soft hum of a violin drifted through the air, warm and familiar, a whisper of something she had once known. She was here because of Gabriel Sterling, because of his belief in her, but as she watched the students move with effortless grace, doubt crept in. They belonged here. She was just a server who had once played well enough to dream of something bigger. She hadn't touched a violin in years, and she didn't even own one anymore. The last time she had held one, she had promised herself it would be the last. That was what made this so terrifying, not just stepping back into this world but allowing herself to want it again. The receptionist at the front desk had been expecting her. Gabriel had arranged everything, right down to the loaner violin from the conservatory's collection. Mila followed a young assistant down a quiet hallway, her heart hammering as they reached a practice room. The woman gestured toward the case sitting on the table and left without another word. Mila approached it slowly, her fingers hovering over the latch before finally flipping it open. The violin was beautiful, polished and well cared for, but it wasn't hers. It didn't carry the weight of her past, the history of late-night rehearsals, the exhaustion of perfecting a passage until her fingers ached. She hesitated before lifting it, the weight of it unfamiliar yet strangely right. She raised it to her shoulder, adjusting her grip as naturally as breathing. The bow hovered over the strings, her hand unsteady. Then, after a deep breath, she played a single note. It wavered, unpolished, but the sound filled the small room, wrapping around her like a forgotten memory. The first few minutes were awkward, her fingers stumbling, her bow hand rigid. Her body resisted, reminding her of everything she had lost, but something deeper pushed her forward. The notes started to come easier, and then, suddenly, it was there, that feeling, the one she thought had died the day she gave it all up. She practiced for hours, losing herself in scales, exercises, old pieces that had once felt like second nature. The muscles in her hands protested, unused to the demand she placed on them, but she ignored the ache. She had a week before the audition. She would make every second count. Across the city, Damien sat in his office, unable to concentrate. He had spent years building an empire, making decisions that affected fortunes, buying and selling properties without hesitation. Yet somehow, the sound of Mila Carter's violin still played in the back of his mind. It was absurd. She was a server, nothing more. He had only wanted to amuse himself, to remind her of her place. He hadn't expected her to be good, let alone extraordinary. And now, people were talking about her, the guests, the staff, even Gabriel Sterling, who had taken it upon himself to sponsor her audition. He told himself it didn't matter. Her playing was nothing more than a fluke, the muscle memory of someone who had once had potential but never enough to succeed. But still, it irritated him. He convinced himself that this was about control, about setting an example. Employees didn't just elevate themselves. They didn't take advantage of moments they hadn't earned. If Gabriel thought he could pluck someone from obscurity and turn her into something more, Damien would remind him that life didn't work that way. Word of the audition reached him through the club's endless stream of whispers. Information traveled quickly in places like this, where favors were currency, and everyone was looking for an advantage. It didn't take much to find out when and where the audition would take place. He didn't need to do anything drastic. Just a little push. The schedule for the upcoming week was set, but a few well-placed changes ensured that Mila was assigned an extra shift the day of the audition. A double, to be exact. By the time she got to the conservatory, she would be exhausted, barely able to hold the bow steady. That should have been the end of it. A simple reminder that ambition meant nothing without power. Mila didn't find out about the schedule change until the night before. She stared at the posted list in disbelief, reading the cruel reality of it. A double shift, covering both the morning and evening. There was no mistake. Damien had done this on purpose. She could call in sick, but she knew how that would go. The club didn't tolerate unreliable staff, and she couldn't afford to lose her job. Panic clawed at her chest. If she showed up at the audition exhausted, she wouldn't stand a chance. But if she missed it entirely, she would regret it for the rest of her life. She barely slept that night. By the time morning arrived, she had a plan. She moved through her shift on autopilot, forcing herself to conserve as much energy as possible. Between tasks, she stretched her hands, rolled her shoulders, did anything to keep her muscles from tightening. She stole bites of food when she could, anything to keep her strength up. The second her shift ended, she was out the door, weaving through traffic, sprinting up the conservatory steps. She arrived breathless, her hands shaking, sweat clinging to her skin. Gabriel was waiting outside the audition room. He took one look at her and frowned. "What happened to you?" "Damien," she said, the exhaustion in her voice unmistakable. Realization flickered across his face, followed by something colder. Of course he did. She didn't have time to dwell on it. The assistant called her name. Gabriel gave her a steady look. "You can do this." Mila wasn't sure she believed that. But she nodded anyway, straightened her back, and stepped inside. The room was silent, the judges seated in a row, their expressions unreadable. She lifted the violin, ignoring the way her arms felt like lead. She placed the bow against the strings. And she played. Mila stood in the center of the audition room, gripping the violin as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The exhaustion from her double shift clung to her, dragging at her limbs, dulling her senses. The judges sat before her in an unbroken line of polite detachment, their pens poised, their eyes unreadable. A single moment, stretched unbearably thin. She took a breath, placed the bow against the strings, and played. The first note wavered, her fingers stiff, her body protesting the effort. She could feel the exhaustion weighing down her movements, threatening to steal what little strength she had left. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might fail. Then something inside her shifted. She pushed past the fatigue, past the ache in her muscles, past the whisper of doubt that had followed her for years. The music took hold, wrapping around her like an old friend, guiding her hands with the ease of memory. The exhaustion faded into the background, replaced by something more powerful, determination, longing, something deep and raw that had been waiting to be set free. The room faded. The judges disappeared. It was just her and the music. She played like she was telling a story, not just performing. Every note carried something real, her struggle, her regret, the years of silence she had forced upon herself. She played as if she were speaking directly to the parts of her that had given up, reminding them that they were still alive. When the last note hung in the air, fragile and aching, silence followed. She lowered the violin, her breath unsteady. The judges exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Then one of them, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, leaned forward. "That was remarkable," she said simply. The tension in Mila's shoulders eased just slightly. The head judge cleared his throat. "We'll be in touch soon with our decision." Mila nodded, murmured her thanks, and walked out of the room. Gabriel was waiting in the hallway. The moment he saw her, he smiled. "You did it, didn't you?" She shook her head, her nerves still too raw. "I don't know." But 2 days later, she did. The acceptance letter arrived in her inbox, formal and professional, but the words on the screen blurred as she read them over and over. She had been chosen. She was officially part of the fellowship. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by something warmer, something unfamiliar. Hope. Gabriel called as soon as he heard. "You deserve this," he told her, and for the first time in years, she thought maybe he was right. But the celebration was short-lived. Because Gabriel had also learned something else, Damien had deliberately tried to keep her from the audition. Gabriel had been in high circles long enough to know how men like Damien operated. It didn't take much to find out about the last-minute schedule change, the calculated move to exhaust Mila before the most important moment of her life. So he went straight to the source. Damien was in his office at the club, reviewing upcoming events, when Gabriel walked in unannounced. "You're going to leave her alone?" Damien barely looked up. "I wasn't aware I needed your permission to run my own club." Gabriel shut the door behind him, his voice cool but sharp. "I know what you did." Damien leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "You'll have to be more specific." The double shift. The attempt to sabotage her audition. Gabriel stepped closer, his usual polished demeanor giving way to something harder. "You're a powerful man, Damien, but I doubt even you would enjoy the reputation of being the kind of person who actively tries to ruin an employee's future out of spite." Damien's smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. "You give me too much credit." "Do I?" Gabriel tilted his head. "Because I can make this very public if you push me. I know people. People who care about reputation, about influence. You built your empire on being untouchable, but how do you think your business partners will feel about aligning with someone who goes out of his way to crush talent? Someone who punishes ambition?" Damien's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze. Gabriel didn't let up. "Walk away, Damien. Let her succeed. Or I swear, I will make sure that everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Damien let out a slow breath, setting his pen down. "You've made your point." "Have I?" A muscle in Damien's jaw tightened. "She's free to do whatever she wants. I won't interfere." Gabriel studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good." He turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Damien sat still, staring at the space where Gabriel had just stood. It wasn't the threat that lingered, it was the realization that he had cared enough to interfere in the first place. He told himself it had been about control, about reminding Mila where she belonged. But that wasn't entirely true, was it? Because when she had played that night at the gala, when she had stood there, gripping that violin as if it was the only thing tethering her to the world, he had felt something he hadn't in years. He had felt the kind of ache that came with remembering. Isabella had played with that kind of emotion. She had loved music with that same unshakable passion, had believed in it the way Mila clearly still did. Damien had buried that part of himself long ago. He had convinced himself it didn't matter. But the night Mila played, something in him had cracked. He thought about the way her music had filled the room, the way it had held people captive, the way even he had found himself listening despite every instinct to ignore it. And now, despite everything, she had still won. She had pushed past his interference, past his calculated attempts to hold her back. She had done exactly what he once believed he could do, fight against the world and win. And he wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the fact that he had tried to stop her or the fact that he had wanted to. The evening unfolded in a seamless display of elegance, the kind of event that made the Caldwell Club a staple of San Francisco's elite. Champagne flowed freely, laughter laced with the casual confidence of the wealthy filled the room, and waitstaff moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, ensuring that no glass remained empty, no guest felt neglected. The night had been planned down to the smallest detail: exclusive guest list, impeccable menu, the perfect balance between luxury and exclusivity. Except for one unexpected request. A well-known philanthropist, seated at the center of the ballroom, leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh of contentment. "The atmosphere is perfect," he mused to the table, swirling his wine lazily. "But you know what would make it even better? Live music." His companions murmured in agreement, nodding. Someone else chimed in. "Yes, something intimate, something real." Damien Caldwell had been listening, even while pretending not to. He had spent years mastering the art of appearing unaffected, of existing in the background of his own events while controlling every aspect of them. But this suggestion, small as it was, struck an uncomfortable chord. He already knew where this was headed. As if on cue, Gabriel Sterling set down his glass and turned toward him with an easy, knowing smile. "I might have a suggestion," he said casually, as though it had only just occurred to him. "Mila Carter." Damien didn't react, not outwardly, though his grip on his glass tightened. The room was already responding to the name. Several guests exchanged interested glances, remembering the unexpected moment at the last event when she had played, how her music had stolen the breath from the room. Gabriel leaned in slightly. "You wouldn't deny your guests a little entertainment, would you?" His voice was light, but the challenge was unmistakable. Damien considered his options. He could refuse, brush it off with some excuse, remind everyone that the club hired professionals for these things. But he could already see the way the guests were waiting for his answer, the subtle curiosity in their expressions. If he denied them now, it would confirm the whispers, that he had tried to sabotage her, that he had crushed an employee's dream out of spite. And if there was one thing Damien despised, it was weakness. So he exhaled slowly, feigning indifference. "If she's willing." It was the safest answer. It placed the choice on Mila. If she declined, no one could accuse him of standing in her way. Gabriel's smile didn't falter. He simply nodded. "I'll ask her." Mila was in the back, folding linen napkins with the kind of focus that only came from trying very hard not to think about the fact that she was here at all. She had told herself she wouldn't let this place affect her anymore, that she was only here because she still needed the job while she prepared for the fellowship. But being in these walls again, after everything, felt heavier than she expected. When Gabriel appeared beside her, she knew before he even spoke. "They want live music," he said simply. She didn't move, didn't answer right away. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her. "They want me to play," she murmured. It wasn't a question. Gabriel studied her for a moment. "You don't have to." But they both knew that wasn't true. This was an opportunity. Not one forced upon her, not one she had been manipulated into. A choice. A way to reclaim the moment Damien had tried to take from her. She straightened, smoothing her hands over her uniform. "Where's the violin?" Minutes later, she stepped into the ballroom, feeling the weight of 100 eyes settling on her. The same people who had barely noticed her when she had been serving their drinks now watched with interest, anticipation. She lifted the violin, adjusted her stance, and took a breath. Then she played. The music was different this time. It carried none of the raw, hesitant energy of that first night. This time, there was confidence in every note, a quiet defiance woven into the melody. She wasn't playing because she had been forced to. She wasn't playing to prove anything to Damien or to these people. She was playing because it was hers. The crowd was silent, transfixed. And in the back of the room, Damien watched. He had told himself it didn't matter, that he had agreed to this only to save face. But the moment she started playing, he knew that was a lie. Something in her music reached him in a way he hadn't let himself feel in years. It was as if she was speaking a language he had long forgotten, one he had buried beneath business deals and power plays and the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. By the time the last note faded into the air, the applause was instant and thunderous. Mila lowered the violin, chest rising and falling with the remnants of adrenaline. But before she could move, Damien stepped forward. She froze. The applause quieted as people turned their attention to him, watching, waiting. He walked toward the stage, each step deliberate. Then he turned to face the room. "I owe you all an apology," he said, his voice steady, but different, less rehearsed, less controlled. The murmurs stilled. He glanced toward Mila before looking back at the crowd. "At our last event, I made an error in judgment. I put someone in a position they did not ask for, forced them into a moment that should have belonged to them and them alone. And yet, despite my interference, she rose above it." Mila's hands tightened around the violin. Damien took a breath. "I underestimated her." He let the words settle before he turned to her directly. "And I was wrong." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then the applause started again. But Mila barely heard it. Because for the first time since meeting him, Damien Caldwell didn't look like the untouchable businessman who had dismissed her so easily. He looked like a man who had just seen something he couldn't ignore. And somehow, that unsettled her more than anything. Mila's life had settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that no longer felt like survival but like something closer to living. Mornings were spent at the conservatory, afternoons studying compositions, evenings rehearsing until her fingers ached. And in between, when the reality of rent and bills couldn't be ignored, she still worked at the club. She could have left after the fellowship accepted her. A week after the gala, Damien approached her with an offer. It was after closing, the club quiet except for the lingering scent of wine and the faint echoes of conversation from earlier in the night. He found her in the lounge, rolling silverware into crisp napkins, the kind of mundane task that had become second nature. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I want you to play here," he said simply. "A permanent position. Regular performances, a steady paycheck, complete access to the club's musicians and network." Mila didn't look up right away, carefully folding the last napkin before meeting his gaze. "You want me to be a musician here?" She studied him, searching for the angle, the hidden motive. When he didn't answer, she shook her head. "I appreciate it, but no." His expression didn't shift, but something flickered in his eyes. "No?" She exhaled, setting the napkin aside. "I'm not looking for a comfortable place to land. I need to earn this on my own." She expected him to argue, to tell her she was being foolish, but he only nodded once, as if her refusal had confirmed something he already suspected. "Then keep your job as a server," he said. "For now." It was a tempting offer, but she wasn't ready to accept something that easy, not yet. She wasn't looking for shortcuts, wasn't going to become someone plucked from obscurity and dropped into luxury. That wasn't her story. So she stayed as a server. Damien didn't understand it. When she had refused his offer, he had studied her carefully, waiting for an explanation. But the arrangement worked. She kept her job at the club, working shifts around her studies, slipping in and out of a world that now felt more temporary than it ever had before. And as time passed, things began to shift. The conservatory opened doors she had once thought were shut forever. Word of her performances spread, and soon, offers started coming in. Small gigs at first, private events, intimate concerts, but they grew. She played in front of new audiences, met people who had spent their whole lives in music, people who had never known what it was to lose it and claw their way back. She wasn't just playing again. She was building something. The night finally came when she knew it was time to let go of the club for good. She had landed a position with a touring ensemble, something that would take her across the country for months at a time. It wasn't a guarantee of anything permanent, but it was a step, and it was enough. Her last shift passed in a blur. She had expected to feel something, nostalgia, maybe even sadness, but all she felt was certainty. As she changed out of her uniform for the last time, a voice called her name. One of the managers told her Damien wanted to see her before she left. Her stomach tightened. She almost considered ignoring it. Whatever words needed to be exchanged had already been said. But she also knew leaving without facing him felt unfinished. She walked through the quiet halls of the club, past rooms that once felt like they would be part of her forever. When she reached his office, she hesitated only briefly before knocking. "Come in," he called. She stepped inside, half expecting him to be busy, distracted, already moving on from whatever moment this was supposed to be. But he was waiting, standing by his desk, watching her. "So," he said, leaning back slightly. "This is it?" She nodded. "This is it." He exhaled slowly, as if considering his next words carefully. "I wanted to thank you." She frowned slightly. "For what?" "For proving me wrong," he said simply. "And for reminding me that some things are worth revisiting." Something in his expression softened, just slightly. She didn't know what to say to that. Before she could figure it out, he reached behind his desk, lifted a sleek black case, and placed it in front of her. She stared at it. "What is this?" "A parting gift," he said. She hesitated before opening it. Inside, resting on deep velvet, was a violin. Not just any violin, one of extraordinary craftsmanship, delicate but powerful, the kind only found in the hands of professionals who had long earned their place in the world. She looked up at him, stunned. "Damien, You don't have to accept it," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I want you to have it. As a reminder of how far you've come. And of what's still ahead." She swallowed hard, her fingers brushing over the wood. "You didn't have to do this," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "Neither did you." She closed the case, holding it carefully. There were things left unsaid, things that neither of them knew how to put into words. But maybe they didn't have to. They had taken a bad situation and made something out of it. That was enough. They shook hands, an understanding that they were now equals. She lifted the case, nodded once, and walked away.